these corporate executive salaries. As I'm sure most of you know, in Europe, in Japan, your corporate executives make about 40 times what the average wage is in their corporations. That is what the average wage earner makes. In the United States, it's 400 times as great. And this is relatively new. This didn't start until the 1980s. Now, I want to digress just a moment. I'm a political scientist by training. I just want to talk about the 2008 election. We have such political scientists have such warped views of elections. We watch it and we say, oh my gosh. And one of those times I said, oh my gosh, was towards the end of the campaign when John McCain and his Sarah Palin were using the idea that Barack Obama was a socialist, and they kept on saying over and he's a socialist, and I think it was this idea of distributing income. But you really have to wonder, it's one of those times when you say, this is Disneyland. I don't know what they think socialism is, or what they think at all. But what I learned in school is that socialism means the state, the government, owns, controls the means of production. That is, they own corporations, they own banks, and so forth. And I didn't hear, Barack Obama talking about taking over anything at this point in time. You might say who'd want to, but the feds do. At the very same time that McCain and Palin were accusing Barack Obama of being a socialist and going to introduce socialism, at that very same time, Henry Paulson, Secretary of Treasury, under the Bush administration, was taking an ownership position in corporations. Okay? That is what Henry Paulson did. He took that bailout money and literally bought shareholder positions in all of the major banks, and he did it without really the approval of Congress. There's nothing in the bailout bill, as we call it, that says you go out and you buy, you become a stockholder in essence, in the major banks. Okay? But that's what he did. All right? And that introduced us to socialism. All right. We're now socialist. And Barack Obama hasn't even been inaugurated yet. Now, if the government, in fact, has a share in these, particularly the banks, the big banks, as they do, then they have a right to make their opinion felt on such issues as executive compensation. That's what you're supposed to do. And here is where they can move in as partial owners and say, you guys, 400% of what your average employee's wages, that's too much. And do something about equality on that high end. The other issue that Krugman, the other policy area that Krugman argues needs to be addressed are unions. And the reason he believes unions need to be given some support, really, is because unionization is found to be associated with more equality, income equality. It's as simple as that. Also, unionization is associated with the working class participating in politics. They're less alienated, they're more involved, and in a democracy that ought to be a good thing. Now, there's many issues involving labor unions, and they've got a whole stack of agenda items, but I would say it would be the right thing to do to enforce the labor laws that are on the books. Under the National Labor Relations Act, unions have a right to organize. They have a right, if they get so many signatures, to hold elections. And under the, going back to the Reagan administration, through the Clinton administration, and through the Bush administration, well, the two Bush administrations, in fact, labor has not had that right, contrary to law. And so that is another area. Another policy area that would reduce inequality has to do, of course, with health care. Health care creates its own inequalities, and clearly if we're looking at education, it's ridiculous to assume that kids can learn if they've got ear infections that aren't being treated. It's ridiculous to assume that kids that are not healthy, whose illnesses are not being adequately addressed, are going to be good students. It's as simple as that. But this is much broader than that. In studies that have been done on bankruptcy, for instance, who are these people who are going bankrupt and want to be bailed out? And the image we have, of course, of people who, you know, they have no control over their credit cards and so forth. But over 30%, and this has been consistent for quite a while, over 30% of the people filing for bankruptcy protection, in fact, are doing it because they're overwhelmed with medical debt. You get a catastrophic illness, and sometimes even with insurance, you may find yourself in the poverty class simply trying to pay off those expenses. And so some kind of health care reform, really the best would be single pay, but I don't think we're going to see that. So these are the kinds of policies, with the exception of health care, and even health care is not something the federal government hasn't been involved in. But these are the kinds of policies that, most of them on the books, that we need to change, strengthen, if we're serious about reducing inequality. And that's kind of assumption I've been going on. Now, when we speak of inequality in education, however, we don't speak of percentiles. Okay, when John introduced the topic, he talked about poor people. Okay, he didn't say the top or the bottom 20%. And we don't think of that. We think about poor kids, we'll think about working class kids, we may define them in terms of race and ethnicity, but we don't think of terms of percentiles. We don't say this is where they fall based on their parents' income. What we do speak of are, once again, these groups or classes. We're really referring to class. And while we do that, however, we don't often refer to what has been called, over 30 years ago, the hidden injuries of class. It was in the early 1970s that two sociologists, Sennett and Cobb, did a study on the hidden injuries of class. It's not just that you don't have enough income, but there are injuries there. But when we look at education, we don't look at that either. We say the parents don't come to school for the PTO. We don't say, gee, they have to work 2-3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. Okay, we don't make that kind of connection. We say parents of poor kids don't come to school. They don't participate in their kids' lives. That is, we focus on certain patterns of behavior associated with poor kids, poor families, working class families. I was reading something about anti-intellectualism. That's a big problem in the lower class. This is somebody who's obviously been